It's called a currency, but it's not quite. It is kind of like a cross between credit and currency.
That's journalist Richard Chirgwin on the cryptographic currency commodity known as Bitcoin. I'm James Purser, and this is Purser Explores the World. I have to be honest, I've known about the topic of this episode of Purser Explores the World for a while. However, it's never been something that's really caught my attention. I'm not very big on the whole economic theory and everything else. However, in the past few weeks, it seems to have caught the whole world's attention. Bitcoin, that cryptographic currency that Richard was talking about in the intro, has exploded into the mainstream news, with values reaching today up to $186 US per Bitcoin. For a little bit of perspective, 24 hours ago, they were trading at around the $145 mark. At the beginning of March, they were trading at $30 US to the Bitcoin. That's a pretty big leap for any currency, never mind something that, when it started, needed $25,000 to buy a pizza. So, the two people I'm going to speak with in this episode help me a lot when it comes to sorting out the fact from the hype. Aimee Maree is an open source architect and citizen of the world who has been involved with Bitcoin for a number of years now, both exploring the idea of cryptocurrency itself and helping to foster the community that is built up around it through activities such as helping to organise the Bitcoin 2012 conference held in London. First off, Aimee is going to tell us what drew her to Bitcoin in the first place.
I guess, well, for me, it's basically, I think, similar reasons that kind of drew me to the GNU Linux project. It was very much the concept. So what Bitcoin really does represent is a decentralized currency. And being somebody, I've always kind of, I guess you could say my hobbies are law and economics.
That's a couple of heavy that's their hobbies.
They're my hobbies, yeah. Computers is what I do for my day job. That's what I kind of where, I guess I've always been interested in it. And I've also always been interested in the failings of the global economic system. So I was when I first found out about it was probably around 2009. And then 2010, when I was in the UK, I met up with some people there that were kind of a little bit that were getting, following it a little bit more and getting a little bit more involved in it. And it was very much, even just from the early days, as I said, it was very much, wow, this is great. It's built on an open source protocol. It's quite a challenging and disruptive idea and concept, just like, the original concepts of free software and open source was. So I think that's really the initial drivers for me for kind of looking a bit more deeper into it. So 2012, last year, I was involved as one of the organisers of the Bitcoin conference in London. And how that came about was a more kind of serendipitous thing. So I was doing organising the Open Source Developers Conference last year in Sydney, and I had someone reach out to me on the web one day and say, look, I'm involved. I want to get this conference, and I'm really just reaching out to a bunch of people and wondering if you don't mind helping, giving me some advice and stuff. And at the time, I happened to be in London. So it was very much, well, I'm in London at the moment. I'm off to Hackney Hackerspace. Where are you? And they're like, oh, I'm actually hanging out at the Hackney Hackerspace. So, and that's kind of where I met Aimee. He was the head organizer of Bitcoin Conference London. And yeah, as I said, I guess the reason also that really drove me to compelled to help him was, apart from the fact that he reached out, and I kind of like helping people. It was also a bit of, it's something that I'd been interested in, something I've been following, and something I'd been playing around with a little bit. So yeah, that I guess that kind of the little bit of the story of how I got involved in Bitcoin and how I've kind of got involved in doing a bit more advocacy and talking about Bitcoin.
So do you use Bitcoin in your day-to-day life?
Bitcoin is pretty much like gold.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So if the zombie apocalypse happened, you're not going to go and buy food with your gold bullions, right? Same thing that you're probably not going to do that with your Bitcoin, that you're not going to be able to do that with your Bitcoins. So there's a lot of things that you can do with Bitcoin. So there is purchases that you can do that can make. So there's T-shirts you can buy. There's, stickers you can buy. There's hosting services you can buy. You can pay people in Bitcoins for doing work as well. If you go onto the bitcoin.org, they have a list of, companies that kind of doing that. Say you're traveling in Europe and you're sitting there with a group of friends and you're trying to work out, okay, there's a bit left over on the tab, we're splitting the tab, how do we work that bit left out? You can exchange in Bitcoins the rest of those, the remainder of that, which has happened. So it's a bit like, as I said, kind of using gold. There's certain things that you are going to use it for, but you get a lot of people sitting on gold, right? Because they're invested in the fact that gold is going to keep on rising as a value. Bitcoins are very similar. So a lot of people are much more hoarding Bitcoins at the moment than they are going out and spending them. You've got, there's WordPress is, using some of the bigger names, WordPress is using Bitcoins. I think Amazon just recently spoke about either starting to or looking at using Bitcoins as well. So their ability to be able to use them in day-to-day life is becoming more.
Well,
definitely.
Sorry, go on.
Definitely the biggest use that a lot of people are kind of using it for is really currencies conversions. So say I get, in places like Australia and America where we have large land masses and we're really traveling around within one border, it's not as apparent. But when you are in a place like Europe where you're traveling around and you're crossing variable borders, then it makes it a lot easier to transfer money across in Bitcoins.
Well,
so that's probably one of the biggest uses.
It really has hit the mainstream at the moment, hasn't it? Well,
it has
the news at the moment, not the mainstream.
Yeah, that's a better analogy of it, because it's I guess it's got to a point like any technology in the sense that it's really kind of it really started to do it towards the end of last year, where it started to really kind of get that critical towards that critical level of interest and kind of a bit of critical mass, a bit of peak there. So when that kind of happens within a technology is a really interesting state as well, because it's either, I guess when it, with the original days of floss and stuff, where it was very much, okay, either, the big guys are going to come in and take this over and really pull it in under their strains, or is it going to still maintain the community and the people and the, ownership through that kind of lines. So that's really something where it's really happening with Bitcoin at the moment as well. So I think it was the Canadian Bank last year, and I believe they're still in the process of the awards of it, but the Canadian Bank started speaking about wanting to have their own mint chip currency, and they had an award process that went out to say to people, look, create applications and work on this stuff for us for having our own digital currency. And you've got some banks around Asia as well that are looking at it. So it's really, it's in that kind of interesting state of a technology right now as to which way it will go.
Well, part of the reason why it's been in the news lately is the fact that it's had a slight increase in value against every so-called real-world currency over the last few weeks. Why do you reckon that is?
All right, so it was, I guess it was around 2011. I think it was just towards the end of 2011 where you had a peak, where it kind of was one of the first valuation peaks, and that was around in the 30s to 40s is where you saw that. And it stayed there for quite a while, then it dropped back down. Bitcoin is very much like gold in the sense that, so Bitcoins can be mined like gold can be mined. It is a limited resource, gold. The world just doesn't churn over an extra, the ground, nature doesn't create, X amount of bullions of gold every day. It's very limited. So Bitcoin is a very similar thing. So it's really one of those things where, early adopters, now to get involved in it, it's a lot harder for people to get involved in it now than it was earlier on. People are seeing its value, hence its rise. Will it sustain going up? I mean, it definitely is probably worth, a lot of people are talking about it being worth a lot more than what it currently is. But like any currency, and as it already has had peaks and troughs, it's certainly not to say that it will just keep on going up. But it really is. The reason that it's fluctuating so much is because of that, is because of the main interest that you're seeing from, from one, linking it to the American dollar, comparing it to the American dollar, and also, the big players kind of really getting a bit nervous, and B, also some people jumping on board.
In the digging around that I've been doing, the one thing I've noticed is that Bitcoin's not the only coin out there.
No, it's...
Sorry, go on.
Yeah, you're right, yep.
So the Mt. Gox Bitcoin exchange is going to be adding something called Litecoin to its exchange over the next few weeks, as far as I can see. Is that going to dilute the brand of the cryptocurrency?
Well, it'd be interesting. I mean, who knows? That's something that I can't really speculate on. But I've always said, and for me, why I love Bitcoin and why I talk about Bitcoin is more about the concept of what it's kind of really representing, which is a decentralized currency that's not controlled by any one border, and not controlled by a bunch of banks sitting at the top of it. So do I think that in the next 40, 50, 60 years, Bitcoin might still be around? Probably, maybe, probably not. Will there be others that are coming along? Yes. Litecoin is one of them. There's been a couple of others as well. There's like a couple of other works on different protocols and things out there that are more slightly not as decentralized and not as anonymous. So, it's really kind of, I guess it's like, and I draw the analogy back to GNU Linux, where that wasn't the kernel that necessarily, components of that kernel, ideas of that kernel made it into what then became the Linux kernel, and then from their various distributions grew. That is something that I definitely see, and a lot of others have spoken about happening within the Bitcoin, the digital currency arena.
Do you think there's a sense of maybe a bit of a gold rush mentality when it comes to these things?
Yes, I do. But then I think that about any kind of, if you look back throughout history throughout different currencies, you'll find that happen. And as I said, it very much is one of those things as in the early adopters, similar to, looking at technology bubbles. So, similar to the first player, the first ones involved tend to reap a lot of money from it, or, reap a lot of success from it, if you claim a lot of success, if you call it that. And then it starts to dilute as it becomes more and more, everyday kind of use. The interesting thing about Bitcoin, as I said, is very much that it's based on the idea. So it's based very much on Austrian economics, and it's based on that whole gold, the idea of gold, and being a limited resource. So there can only ever be so many Bitcoins in the system, the way that not without getting into deep technical talks, the way that the algorithm works. Similar to, as I said, gold as a resource, there can only ever be so much gold. But that is kind of, I guess, it is a different encryption that Litecoin uses. And it's a bit, one of the things is because of the different encryption, it doesn't make it as vulnerable to some of the larger custom kind of like the more hardware attacks and things like that we've been seeing as well.
That's the other thing. I mean, Bitcoin, as we've seen with other encryption methods, MD5 has been cracked, other encryption methods have been cracked. How vulnerable is the Bitcoin algorithm?
To go into that without speaking about
well, just on a scale of, I mean, I know it's hard not deep dive into the actual crypto, but sort of on a scale of 1 to 10, in your opinion.
Well, I'd hate to say what level, the blockchain that it uses is that's kind of one of the things why Bitcoin has risen and why it's continued to work is because the hashing out, like the actual blocks that it's using, are pretty like you can state where this block is cut. Like you can't just kind of, unlike the dollar, for example, where where a country can turn around and all of a sudden just produce, bang, all of a sudden here you go, mints, we've produced another extra, million dollars. You can't do that in Bitcoin because of the way the blocking algorithm works. So that's what makes it quite secure. A lot of the attacks that you're seeing are much more. A lot of them are really even much more kind of from your old, like not just DDoS attacks, but really kind of much more on that level, rather than attack at the actual algorithm, the blocking chain itself.
More your social hacking than your mathematical hacking.
In a sense, yeah.
Because I noticed MT Gox had been suffering a DDoS attack for the last few days as well.
They have, yeah, and that's happened to other exchanges in the past as well. Or in some of the, a lot of. So there's a lot of there's a lot of kind of Bitcoin exchanges out there, right? You've got a lot of the really good, the larger ones, and not only that, the more, the ones, and then you've got a lot of smaller ones, I guess, where, there's the way that they're storing their data isn't a secure method. The way that they're doing, so it's kind of similar to, your shitty hosters and your good hosters.
When I first met Aimee at linux.conf.au, I could tell she had a real passion for the idea of a truly independent and secure digital currency, and I think that really does come out in that interview. I think she's right in that as a concept, the idea of a purely digital currency, something that isn't controlled by one organisation or another, has a certain appeal. Whether Bitcoin is going to be that currency is up for debate. Richard Chirgwin is a science journalist, tech commentator, and in his spare time he runs a beautiful little bed and breakfast nestled deep in the Blue Mountains. He has been tracking Bitcoin and the Bitcoin community from a distance, both reporting on it and exploring the pros and cons of digital currencies in general.
Let's start with the current inflation of Bitcoins, which, whether or not you agree with the attribution, and it has been debated as to whether or not it is arising out of Cyprus or not, what it does illustrate is what possibly is arguably the number one problem, at least that I would point out, and that is with relatively few number of Bitcoins in existence, with a relatively low number of Bitcoins in existence at relatively high notional value, they're actually not all that liquid. It doesn't take many transactions to cause a big shift in the notional value of the Bitcoin. And because the credit system itself is limited by that cryptographic, by its cryptographic hash, by the SHA-256 that you have to solve to get new Bitcoins, you can't solve a liquidity crisis in a traditional currency way of simply issuing more of the stuff. So that's just kind of encapsulates one of the issues, and that is that because it is what it is, and that is because it is not a fiat currency, if there's a problem, it can't be managed by policy.
Bitcoin is, as you say, it's a limited resource. It is an intentionally limited resource. Yeah. The actual algorithm which determines how many Bitcoins is going to peter out of what, 21 million?
Yeah, something. Yep.
But that's going to be in 21.
I don't have that exactly. Yep.
It's going to take so long as that'll happen in 21 and something. But this does mean, as you say, that we're up to, I'm just having a look at the MT Gox exchange at the moment. The last price in US dollars is $143 US to a Bitcoin.
Yep.
Considering we started the year at $30 US a Bitcoin.
Yeah.
That's quite impressive.
Well, it's impressive, but I think, if you're looking at it objectively, just from a currency point of view, it's also worrying because because it is subject to just as much swing in the down direction as in the up. But second, it also makes it manipulable. If we say, hang on, there's $1.x billion worth of Bitcoin's notional value right now, and they're $140 each, so we'll call it, I don't know, 20,000 or something. But somebody with deep pockets can move that almost at will.
It's not only that, it's also the fact that Bitcoin has been, and well, the actual cryptographic system has not been cracked yet, and it'll take a while for that to possibly happen. But the system built up around it is vulnerable to hacks. We've had exchanges hacked and Bitcoin stolen.
We've had wallets hacked.
Yep.
Individuals, yes. Yep.
We've had distributed denial of service attacks on some of the larger exchanges occur, which has slowed down transactions and yada, yada, yada. Yep. So, and all of this will affect the share, well, sorry, not the share price, the price of...
Yep.
It is a bit like shares, isn't it?
It is. I mean, it is. It's called a currency, but it's not quite. It is kind of like a cross between credit and currency. The transfer that happens between A and B can happen entirely without the exchange of anything but information about the transaction, which is a lot more like, in most people's minds, is a lot more like a credit card than a currency. But down at the bottom, you've got that, right now, the hash is robust, but the hash itself is a vulnerability. If somebody produces a solution to SHA-56, then Bitcoin ceases to have the foundation that gives it its value.
And that's not unforeseeable, is it? I mean, we go on, MDA5 has been hacked, SHA1, we're looking at a progression. As computing power goes on, we're looking at a progression of hashes being hacked.
I mean, quantum computing, people, it's one of the things that a quantum computer is good for. The algorithms exist now to break 256, SHA-256. The machine doesn't yet exist, but the algorithms already do. If you can produce a quantum computer that will reliably factor large numbers, that's the end of Bitcoin. A lot of the problem there, or the parallel problem in my sort of experience writing about Bitcoin, is also that there is a fairly strong dislike for discussing these things, that you will that the discussion is met as often as not with evangelism. That you're wrong because you don't understand Bitcoins, or you're wrong because you're taking the opinion of the government, or you're wrong because you are deluded and conservative, rather than, well, yes, there's a problem here, now let's put good brains onto solving it.
It does have, the Bitcoin thing does have a bit of does have a touch of the political ideology about it, doesn't it?
It has a I just bumped the microphone. It has a strong political ideology about it, and a big chunk of that ideology is anti-government, anti-tax, and hard libertarian. But we have at the same time, as I said, this sort of evangelical mindset that the problem is only the discussion of problems is itself damaging to Bitcoin. If you want a solution, then the problems have to be up for public debate.
So the first rule of Bitcoin is we don't talk about the problems with the Bitcoin.
Yes, indeed. There is that about it. And that sort of, that in my mind feeds into what the reason that some commentators look at it as having the characteristics of a, if not a Ponzi scheme, at least kind of pyramid selling. A new user will get lower ROI, or a new miner or the next buyer should get lower ROI than the one of 2010 because that's designed into Bitcoin. Now, viewed dispassionately, that's okay. But if you then say, we shouldn't talk about that, we should keep from the new player that they are stuck on a declining ROI curve, a wish not to talk about that makes it sound evangelistic and makes it sound Ponzi scheme-ish.
Yeah, because, I mean, with a lot of these technologies, early adopters are generally the ones who benefit the most.
Well, true. Or and you know, actually, in terms of, if you like, consumer products, it's funny that, you know, early adopters are often the ones that, in fact, pay the greatest premium. You know, people paid more in relative terms for an iPhone 3 years ago than the person who puts up with being the last on the list. But as I said, in the Bitcoin discussion, the newest person, in the Bitcoin discussion, people need to at least be aware of that declining ROI, or just in terms of equity, just in terms of them knowing what they're getting themselves in for. If that's not a permissible part of the debate, then it's because someone's trying to conceal that from the suckers.
Well, I mean, 3 years ago when Bitcoin was launched, it was basically anybody with a PC could start mining Bitcoins. Yeah. I mean, we had the famous case of the ABC guy who's installed on a work server a Bitcoin miner. You know, he got fired, but if he held on to his Bitcoins, he'd be laughing right now. Yeah. But nowadays, it's not really practical. I mean, it's to the point where in order to get the next hash and get the next block, you need to have a farm of machines.
Or you need to have a farm of machines. There are people buying purpose-built FPGAs to fill programmable gate arrays for those not familiar with the jargon. To specifically programmed hardware or specifically programmable hardware, so that they can have the next block, so that they can have an edge. So it's also becoming, if you like, elitist. That the only way that you can participate these days is to be part of a technical elite, or simply buy on an open exchange with the exposures that entails. And here I don't mean just security exposures, but the currency and the manipulability and all those other exposures. But only the cognoscenti are able to be generators of Bitcoins. I think techs like that, or that the participants, the geek participant, is saying sort of like, here is something where it's where technical capability alone is the determinant of success, and that makes it attractive. But if we're talking about a currency needs to be inclusive as well.
Now, Bitcoin's not the only digital currency out there at the moment, is it?
No, it is the one that, so to speak, in the way of so many technologies, that power law thing that says only a few take off.
So it's sort of like the iPhone of cryptographic currencies.
It appears to be in just the same way as Google was the last man standing in search.
Because I've noticed in my research around this and hanging around in IRC channels and whatnot, yes, I am a bit of a geek. I've noticed that there's things called Litecoins starting to appear. The people are starting to, because the Bitcoin source is open.
Yes.
And people are starting to fork it.
Oh, good heavens. That was inevitable too. I haven't thought about the implications of that, to tell you the truth. It may not necessarily be a bad thing. It may be, for example, that in forking it, somebody could solve some of the problems we discussed, like there's too few Bitcoins. The person, remembering that the creator of Bitcoin had in mind an experiment.
Do we know much about the creator of Bitcoins?
Me, not at all. It was kind of pseudonymous for even in its release.
Yeah, well, see, I mean that adds to the mystique, I guess, about this whole thing, and then also the libertarian. It's a bit like somebody in a digital Guy Fawkes mask, slapping down a new currency and saying, "Ha, take that, government."
Yes, it is. It is. Now, I mean, there has to be a certain paradox about using what was originally creation of government, the internet, to throw around the idea of a currency without government. But
I keep going back to the scene in Monty Python's Search for the Holy Grail, where we're in an anarcho-syndicalist commune.
Yes, yeah, indeed. But yeah, the idea of it being forked is, well, again, it's interesting. It may not be the last. It may well be that what we are actually seeing is simply that Bitcoin will be ultimately seen as the first experiment, and that it'll take a lot more, because it'll take solutions to some of the problems before you have a final thing, and that comes back to the question of what is, if you like, acceptable in the discussion and debate about Bitcoin. If the debate is kept away from identifying and solving problems, then it's more likely that something else will simply supplant it. That somebody will, over time, the people will say, okay, here are what we see are problems. Here is a second offering that becomes a solution to it.
Evolution in action.
Evolution in action, yes. And of course, if you are stuck with the old DNA, then there will be people complaining, and there will be resistance too. There will be always resistance to the supplanting of Bitcoin.
I'd like to thank both Aimee and Richard for taking the time to chat. They've certainly helped clear things up for me. Bitcoin is an experiment, an evolutionary step that started with things like Second Life's lindens. Remember those stories about islands in Second Life for selling more than real houses? And something called beans, which was around in the early days of the interwebs. It was, if you go back to the .com boom to look them up. Whatever your opinion on Bitcoin, whether you think it's all a mad scheme to milk people out of real money, or you think it's the second coming of the gold standard come to save us all, or something in between, there is no doubting that Bitcoin has had an impact, and will probably continue to have an impact long past the current boom. People are already building on the ideas and code that created Bitcoin to come up with their own versions and iterations of the cryptocurrency idea. This is not something that's going to go away. This is also going to be something that governments are going to have to deal with. How will they be able to regulate Bitcoin? Will they be able to regulate Bitcoin? The very idea of it is decentralized. It's against that sort of control. Anyway, that's it for another episode of Purser Explores the World. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, and you get this podcast via iTunes, why not leave a review? The more reviews you leave, good or bad, the better we can figure out how our shows are going. Also, don't forget that you can help support Angry Beanie by becoming a regular donor, purchasing Angry Beanie merch, or just telling other people about our shows. See you next time.